Where the Light Ends. Dr. Eris Thorne existed in a world of ghosts and data. For 6 years since the accident that took her husband David and her nerve, her life had been a sterile enclosure of algorithms and sonar readouts at a California Marine Institute. She was the world's foremost expert on chemosynthetic ecosystems, yet she hadn't been in the water since the day she'd been pulled, screaming, from the wreckage of the Triton submersible. The deep ocean, once her passion, was now the geography of her nightmares. So when the Institute's director called her in to talk about the Serpent's Maw, a newly discovered hydrothermal vent system in the Tonga Trench, teeming with impossible life and slated for destruction by a deep-sea mining conglomerate, her refusal was instant and absolute. The director pushed a tablet across the desk. "They start drilling in 3 weeks, Eris. You wrote the book on this. You're the only one who can lead this expedition, the only one who can document what we're about to lose." The images on the screen were of a breathtaking alien world, a world she had once dreamed of, a world that had become her tomb. The pressure was immense, a full-court press from the academic and environmental communities. They invoked David's name, his legacy. They didn't understand that every mention was another turn of the screw in her psyche. That night, she pulled a dusty, hard case from the back of her closet. Inside lay her old dive watch and a framed photo of her and David, squinting in the sun on the deck of a research vessel, younger and utterly fearless. The woman in the photo was a stranger to her now. The thought of the submersible's cramped sphere, the groaning pressure, the absolute blackness. It was a physical sensation, a phantom weight crushing her chest. Agreeing to this felt less like a choice, and more like a surrender to the ghosts she could no longer outrun. With trembling hands, she emailed the director. "I'm in." The research vessel Odyssey smelled of diesel, salt, and impending dread. It was a world of hardened professionals who moved with purpose. Eris felt like an imposter, a fragile academic in a land of giants. Then she met him. Kenji Ken Tanaka was the pilot of the Hadal, the deep-sea submersible. He was a former Navy SEAL, with a stillness about him that was both unnerving and calming. He didn't offer condolences or platitudes. He just looked at her with dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through her carefully constructed facade, shook her hand, and said, "I've studied the specs on the Triton. The Hadal is a different machine. We'll run a full systems check before we even touch the water." It wasn't reassurance, it was a statement of fact, and for some reason, it was the first thing that had made her breathe normally all day. The first test was a dry dive. The Hadal sat in its cradle on the deck, but inside, with the hatch sealed, it was another world. The recycled air, the hum of the electronics, the confined space, it was all too familiar. Eris's heart hammered against her ribs, the walls of the titanium sphere seeming to shrink. A full-blown panic attack seized her, cold and absolute. She gasped for air that wasn't there. Ken didn't touch her. His voice cut through the noise in her head, calm and procedural. "Dr. Thorne, acknowledge comms check." She couldn't speak. "Eris, look at the oxygen sensor. Read me the number." He gave her a sequence of simple, technical tasks, pulling her, inch by inch, out of the spiraling terror. By the time the hatch opened, she was drenched in sweat, utterly spent, but she was breathing. She couldn't sleep. The vast, black expanse of the Pacific at night was a mirror to her fear. She found Ken on the observation deck, watching the ink-black water. They stood in silence for a long time before he spoke. "In the SEALs, your life depends on the guy next to you. Not just his skill, his mind. You have to trust that he's steadier than you are when things go sideways. Because they always go sideways." He wasn't talking about the Navy. He was talking about the two of them, in a metal ball, thousands of feet below. "I'm a good pilot, Doctor," he said, finally looking at her. "But I need my scientists to be present. I need to know you're with me." It was a challenge and an offer, an invitation into a bubble of trust. The descent was a journey through descending shades of blue into absolute black. The pressure gauge climbed relentlessly. 1,000 meters. 2,000. Eris's knuckles were white where she gripped her console. Ken's voice was a steady, low murmur, a constant stream of system checks and navigational adjustments. He didn't ignore her fear, but he refused to let it be the only thing in the cockpit. To your left, he said softly. Siphonophore, a colonial organism. That one's nearly 40 feet long. He narrated the abyss, transforming it from a monstrous void into a hidden, living world. He pointed out the constellations of bioluminescence, the strange, ghostly forms that drifted past the viewport, turning her terror into a fragile sense of wonder. When the Hadal's lights hit the serpent's maw, Eris forgot to breathe for a different reason. It was a cityscape from a dream, vast spires of minerals venting superheated water, creating a shimmering, otherworldly garden in the crushing dark. It was teeming with life that had never seen the sun. The scientist in her roared to life, eclipsing the fear. Her voice was sharp, confident, her commands to Ken precise as she directed the robotic arms, collected samples, and documented a world no human had ever seen. For 2 glorious hours, she was not a widow, not a victim. She was an explorer at the edge of creation, and she was magnificent. A loud bang echoed through the hull, followed by a high-pitched alarm. A hydraulic line for the main robotic arm had ruptured. It was a manageable problem, but the sound, the sudden, violent noise and the pressurized silence, was a key unlocking the darkest room in her mind. The present dissolved. She was back in the Triton, the screech of buckling metal, the spiderweb of cracks in the viewport, David's hand reaching for her as the water exploded in. She screamed his name, her hands flying to her head as she tried to block out a memory that was suddenly, terrifyingly real. Ken's hands were on her, firm, pulling her own hands away from her face. "Eris, look at me," he commanded, his voice a blade that sliced through the memory. "David is gone. You are here. You are in the Hadal, and you are safe with me." He kept his eyes locked on hers, his grip grounding her in the here and now. The past receded, leaving her gasping, tears streaming down her face, the raw agony of her loss as fresh as it was 6 years ago. She collapsed against him, a storm of grief in the crushing stillness of the abyss. He just held her, a solid, unwavering anchor in the deepest, darkest place on Earth. Back on the Odyssey, the shared trauma of the dive hung between them, an unspoken and unbreakable bond. That night, she found her way to his cabin. Words were useless, inadequate for what lay between them. When he opened the door, his expression was not one of surprise, but of quiet understanding. His touch was not a conquest, but a question. Her response was a surrender. In the small, Spartan cabin, they came together with a desperate, healing intensity. It was a raw, frantic collision of 2 solitudes, a fierce affirmation of life in the face of death, a reclamation of a body she had long since abandoned to grief. It was flesh and breath and sweat, a way of mapping the living, breathing present over the ghosts of the past. The subsequent dives were different. The fear was still there, a cold companion she now knew by name, but it no longer held the controls. She was its master. She and Ken operated as a single entity, a seamless unit of scientist and pilot. Their communication was fluid, often nonverbal, a shared glance or a slight gesture conveying more than words ever could. They worked with a relentless, brilliant efficiency, gathering a treasure trove of data that would rewrite textbooks. The abyss had taken everything from her, and in some strange, profound way, it was now giving her back to herself, piece by piece. The morning after she first went to his cabin, Eris felt a tremor of a different kind. Panic. What had she done? She had treated him like a cure, a dose of life to fight back the dead. She avoided him, burying herself in data, the familiar comfort of numbers. But on a ship this size, avoidance was a temporary strategy. He found her in the lab late that night. He didn't crowd her, just leaned against the opposite counter. "You can run, Eris," he said, his voice low. "But we're still in the same boat." She finally looked up from her microscope, her eyes full of conflict. "It was a mistake." "Was it?" he asked, his gaze unwavering. "Or was it the first, honest thing you've done in years?" His words chipped away at her defenses. A mistake felt clean, something you could apologize for and move past. But honesty, that was messy. That had consequences. The next day, in the mess hall, she saw him laughing with some of the deckhands. A deep, easy sound that sent a jolt through her. It was the sound of a man who was fully in his own life. For 6 years, she had been a ghost in hers. She walked over, her heart thudding, and sat down across from him. She didn't say anything, just met his eyes. A silent question. He gave her a small, slow nod. A silent answer. That night, the sea was calm, the sky littered with stars. They met on the bow, away from the lights and the crew. "I don't know how to do this," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "I feel like I'm betraying him." Ken took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. "David's story is written, Eris. You can honor it, but you can't live in it. You have to write your own." He told her about his time in the service, about the friends he'd lost, the weight of carrying their memories. He didn't equate their losses, but he understood the landscape of grief. He understood the guilt of being the one who survived. Their next dive was a ballet of shared purpose. The fear in Eris had been replaced by a sharp, exhilarating focus. She saw the abyss not as a tomb, but as a frontier, and Ken was her partner in discovery. "Pan left, 20 degrees, she'd murmur, and the Haddah would move before she finished the sentence. "There, that bacterial mat. Can you get me a core sample?" He'd maneuver the robotic arm with surgical precision, his eyes flicking between the controls and her face, gauging her excitement. In the silent, pressurized world of the deep, they had created a language all their own, a language of trust. The data they were collecting was revolutionary. It proved the serpent's maw was one of the most unique and vital ecosystems on the planet. The victory felt shared, a testament to their partnership. The nights became theirs. They didn't always end in his bunk. Sometimes they just talked, sharing stories of their lives before the sea had claimed them in different ways. She told him about meeting David in grad school, their shared passion for the unknown. He told her about growing up in Hawaii, the son of a fisherman, the ocean in his blood, long before the Navy put him in a uniform. One night, she woke from a nightmare, not of the Triton, but of David. In the dream, he was watching her with Ken, his face not angry but sad. The guilt was a physical weight. She slipped out of Ken's arms and went to her own cabin, pulling out the framed photo. She looked at the smiling man, the boy she had loved. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "but I have to live." It felt like a betrayal and a liberation all at once. She was finally giving herself permission to move on, not away from David's memory, but forward with it. She returned to Ken's cabin. He was awake, waiting. He didn't ask where she'd been. He just opened his arms, and she went into them. This time, when they came together, it was different. The desperation was gone, replaced by a deep, searching tenderness. It wasn't about forgetting the past or chasing away ghosts. It was about two whole, scarred people choosing to map their futures together. His hands traced the lines of her body not with frantic need, but with a reverence that made her feel seen for the first time in years. It was slow and deep, and it was a promise. Her body, which had felt like a stranger's for so long, began to feel like her own again. With Ken, she rediscovered not just pleasure, but sensation. The feel of his skin against hers, the taste of salt on his lips, the low rumble of his voice in his chest. It was an awakening of the senses that mirrored her scientific reawakening in the deep. He was patient and attentive, learning the new language of her body as fluently as they had learned to communicate in the sub. He made her feel safe enough to be vulnerable, strong enough to be soft. Their bond became an open secret on the Odyssey. The crew saw the change in her. The haunted, fragile woman who had boarded the ship was gone. In her place was a confident, vibrant scientist who laughed in the mess hall and held her head high. She and Ken moved around each other with an easy familiarity, a magnetic pull that was obvious to everyone. They were a team, in the water and out. Their connection wasn't a distraction from the mission, it was the fuel that made its success possible. On the final dive, they faced their biggest challenge. A sudden, unexpected tectonic tremor shook the vent field. A massive spire, weakened by the shift, began to collapse directly above the Hadal. Alarms blared. There was no time for careful calculation. "Go," Eris yelled, her eyes locked on the sonar. Full ascent now, Ken didn't hesitate. He trusted her instinct completely, firing the vertical thrusters, pushing the sub into a gut-wrenching climb, just as tons of rock and superheated water crashed into the space they had occupied seconds before. They broke the surface, the Hadal battered but intact. The silence in the cockpit was profound. They had stared into the abyss and won. Ken reached over and switched off the main alarm, then turned to her. He didn't say a word, just cupped her face in his hands and kissed her. A deep, soul-shaking kiss that tasted of relief and adrenaline and the promise of a future. It wasn't a kiss of passion, but of profound, grateful partnership. They had saved each other. The data they brought back was undeniable. The mining conglomerate was forced to halt its plans, and the Serpent's Maw was designated a protected international marine sanctuary. Eris became the voice of the deep, a passionate advocate for the world she had once feared. She had gone down into the darkness to document a world on the verge of extinction, and had, in the process, saved herself from the same fate. Months later, Eris stood on the balcony of her small California bungalow, looking out at the Pacific. The ocean no longer looked like a grave. It was a place of terrible power, of impossible beauty, of endings and beginnings. She heard the screen door slide open behind her. Ken came to stand beside her, handing her a mug of hot coffee. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, pulling her back against his chest. "What are you thinking about?" he murmured into her hair. She leaned back into his warmth, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the sea met the sky. "About how strange it is," she said softly, "that you have to go to the darkest place in the world to find the light." The future was as vast and unknown as the sea before her, and for the first time in years, she was not afraid to sail it. She was home,